Hi guys, this is Mr. Tan, and today we're going to be looking at Pestle, breaking down the individual elements of this model. We're going to be looking at how you should actually use this, combined with some tips. We're going to be looking at who would use this information, and then the advantages and disadvantages of Pestle. Look at Pestle. We can see, and most of you know, that Pestle has 6 elements: the political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental sections. And Pestle itself, with these 6 different sections, is supposed to be an external environmental analysis of factors within these different sections that could actually affect your business in the long term. And the first of these are the political factors, which includes elements such as the tax policy of a country. If we take the UK for example, what is the corporation tax of the UK? Currently it is at 19%, but now there are talks about the corporation tax going back up to 22%, and then the possibility of going 25%, and some MPs have been discussing even 28%. Well, that matters because of investment coming into the UK and how much corporation tax a company would pay. If we look in comparison to Ireland, the corporation tax in Ireland is only 12.5%. But, does the corporation tax matter that much? I'm not too sure. With the accounting procedures and their subsidiary companies and parent companies in tax haven countries means that big organizations and multinationals pay very little tax because they manage to get round the laws from a legal perspective in terms of paying the minimum that they need to pay. But tax policy obviously is going to be a factor that may influence medium to small companies investing in your country as opposed to another country. Other elements include political stability. How stable is your country? Because if you've invested in Ukraine or in Russia, then it could be disastrous for you, not thinking that how political stable these countries were and what would actually happen. If we look at some of the businesses that have rented out and leased their airplanes to Russia, Russia have said that they're not going to pay into the Russian government. So that's potentially disastrous for those companies. If we think about the recent Brexit, which only came to effect on the 31st of Jan 2020, well, what are the implications for Brexit that the UK have moved away? Well, even if you're a business in the UK selling into Europe, that's going to affect you. It's going to affect you in terms of if you're exporting, in terms of your packaging. The packaging will no longer be the same. Your rules and regulations for your packaging as outside the EU going into the EU would mean that you would need to change your packaging and put on more red tape and more changes to meet their standards. If we think about workers in the UK, if we talk about the crops in the UK and the farmers and picking the crops at specific times where a lot of workers would come over specifically from Europe to work to pick the crops, well, then those workers would no longer be legally entitled to, and those companies couldn't employ those unless they had the right permits to actually be employed and to work in the UK. If we think about and we look at the lorry drivers getting our the right number of people who used to drive the lorries, and a lot of those people used to be employed from Europe. Now the UK needs to train and pay higher wages for UK citizens to actually drive their trucks, to make sure we can get the full logistics of all the goods and services that we want. That's going to have an impact on inflation, because the higher costs that these companies have to pay their staff is the less profits they need to make, so they need to then charge higher prices onto those other companies, which will then pass it on to their customers. Then they will pass it and increase their food costs or service costs, which will then come back down to us in terms of the end consumer. So again, you have to look in that country and that you're actually looking at reviewing in relation to your business or service. And the typical example is in the UK. And again, if you go back to Brexit, what does it mean for competition? What does it mean for competition that you know the UK government wanted to have more trade with food being imported from the US? Well, there were huge concerns because you've got cheaper food coming in from huge manufacturers from the US, and the standards and the quality of their food is not to the same quality as UK foods. Before, within the EU, in terms of EU trade and regulations, food had to be of a certain standard. So you couldn't have chicken which had been washed by chlorine, and you couldn't have beef that was treated with hormones, which the EU disallow, but is standard practice in the US. So now the UK is not part of the EU, and it was suggested that MPs wanted to allow more freer trade of food from the US, therefore potentially lowering the standards. Then if you've got cheaper beef and chicken coming in, then that's going to mean increased competition for local farmers and traders who actually deal and sell beef and chicken in the UK. So again, when you look at the political side, you need to look at the country which you're looking at, and then relate these policies, the environmental regulations, the trade restrictions, reforms, how stable is it, and their tax policies, and what's actually been happening politically, and where is that country going from a political perspective. We look at the economic side in terms of exchange rates, inflation, wage rates, minimum wage, working hours, unemployment, and all these things can actually affect the value of a country's currency. So if you wanted to, go international and you wanted to actually trade in another country from the UK or the United States, then you have to look at the currencies of different countries to see if there's huge fluctuations. And at times when that currency is actually low, it could actually net you lower net profits from that country. So again, this is something that needs to take into consideration. If we look at the sociological, cultural norms and expectations, health consciousness, population growth rates, age distribution, career attitudes, health and safety, what is actually happening in that country in terms of the culture, the norms, and the changes. If we look at the UK, we can see that there's a more of an emphasis in terms of fast food restaurants, in terms of healthier foods, labeling in terms of healthy foods, in terms of the salts, in terms of the contents, in terms of the fat, in terms of the labels, in terms of red, green, and yellow, and even in terms of consumers actually wanting healthier foods in fast food restaurants, which then in terms of the hospitality side will have an impact in terms of those restaurants now changing their product range slightly and adding more health and health conscious type of product ranges, such that McDonald's, for instance, have like now a salad, and so on and so forth. And we're going to see how cultural norms within different countries can actually affect and direct a company's or firm's strategy in terms of what they do. Technological advances, where we've seen the great leap in and of technology in today's environment with social media, with buying online and internet banking. Even if we take Tesco's, for instance, we've seen Tesco's first introduce the scanning your food inside. They were the first retailers to do that. We've seen Tesco's introduce things like their online stores. We've seen Ocado. Now you can actually buy and food is actually delivered to your homes. We've seen things like cross-docking inside Tesco's, so they're not holding merchandise, so they're actually selling goods, high item ticket items on their website, and then emailing these orders out to the prospective companies that they deal with, and then those companies hold the stock, and Tesco's don't hold the stock, therefore lowering their overall costs. We've seen the internet, we've seen the Tesco's Club Card, and all these technological advances are actually changing the environment and affecting how and what companies do. Even if we look at Thomas Cook, Thomas Cook had been in business for over 178 years. They had over 19 million customers with an average turnover per annum of £9 billion. And yet we saw that in 2019, they went into liquidation. They were facing competition from a range of different areas. They're facing competition from the online, and their packaged holidays were now being, competed against by people, ordinary consumers, putting together their own packages and then going to low-cost airlines and organizing their own flights. We saw that happening. So again, Thomas Cook tried to link up with My Travel, and they did that, but in 2019, in the first half of the year, My Travel was written down in terms of the balance in the books in terms of 1.1 billion. Together with a loss or pre-tax loss or 1.5 billion as well, which totaled a 2.5 billion pound loss in the first half of the year of 2019. And then later on, we saw the collapse of Thomas Cook. We look at the legal side, legal changes to legislation impact upon employment, access to materials, quotas, resources, imports, exports, and taxation. If you're going to be going into another country, you're going to be looking at the legal aspect in terms of all these areas, in terms of minimum rates, minimum rates of pay. And even if we think about the UK, and if we don't have a trade deal, what are we going to do in terms of all the packaging? Because at the moment the packaging is in line with European packaging. Then we might have to go through the legal system in terms of legalizing all the packaging and redoing it all. And the whole process of going through the legal process in the UK means a first reading, a second reading, committee stage, a report stage, a third reading, and then going on to the next house, and then going back to the first house for any amendments, and then passing on to the Queen. So it's a long and lengthy process to have all this legislation to change all these rules that we need to implement in terms of how we label goods and services when going into another country. Even if we think about the environment, again, the environment now, has a huge impact in terms of global warming and the increased need to switch to sustainable resources, ethical sourcing, both locally and nationally, including the supply chain. Well, why is this so important? This is so important because we have free information around the world, social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, and we know what's going on around the world, so that if you're not environmentally friendly and you are, putting out too many emissions or not doing what you need to do, then people will know about it. So, and that could affect the perception of your customers, whether or not they decide to buy from you or someone else who is more environmentally friendly than your company is. So all these factors are going to affect the consumer buying behavior model in terms of how and why people buy. So this cannot be ignored. Things, by analyzing those factors, organizations can gain an insight into the external influences which may impact their strategy and business decisions. So we're really talking about a situation analysis. It allows the HR and senior managers to, assess any risks specific to their industry and organization, and to use the knowledge to inform their decisions. When we look at Pestle, Pestle can be related to various other models, and that includes ETPS, STEP, PEST, and STEEPLE, where the additional E stands for the ethical side. So throughout, you may read many different articles or journals or books, and you may see many different models, but one of the commonmost model is Pestle. Okay. Again, Pestle stands for political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and the legal aspects from the external side that can have an impact on your business or market sector. So the next question is, how do we actually apply this? How do we actually use it? Well, there are various steps and tips, and one is to identify the scope of the research. It should cover the present and possible future scenarios and apply to all areas of the world in which your business operates or is looking to operate in. So it's important to identify the scope of the research. You need to decide how the information will be collected and by whom. How is it going to be collected? By whom? What information do you want? Data gathered is often more rich in content when more than one person contributes to collecting it. You need to identify appropriate sources of information. These could be stakeholders looking for professionals to address specific issues on current policies that require updating. You might need to get professional, specialized people in to analyze specific types of information. If you were going into America, for instance, you might want to try and find out the consumer buying behavior in terms of the tastes of the Americans. We know that when Tesco's went into America, their portion sizes were not the portion sizes that the Americans ate, and the Americans saw the portion sizes of Tesco's and they thought they were childlike. So again, in addition to that, you've got information like the value of the dollar. If the value of the dollar is fluctuating, where it's decreasing against the value of the pound or the euro, then your profits on the value of the dollar is going to be decreasing. So what information do you need? Can you analyze this yourself? Probably not. You probably need a professional to actually analyze this information, because this requires looking at the economic data. It means looking at the number of jobs and unemployed people in the US. It means looking at the rate of inflation and the predicted rate of inflation. It means looking at the GDP, and it also means looking at the balance of payments. America has over 25 trillion deficit, and in the last half year they've printed, and they've kept on printing money like other countries in terms of quantitative easing. What effect is that going to have on the dollar in the long term? Well, some people say that this may not have too much effect because the dollar is a go-to currency, and it's one of the main currencies in the world that people in times of crisis focus on. But China, Germany are trying to go back, and they are actually buying more gold now. So and America came off the gold standard in the 1970s. So in the future, because of the amount of debt, there is a possibility that the dollar could be devalued severely, and it may not be the main currency in years to come. What impact will that have if you are trading in that country? So you need to actually gather this information from specialists, because this is something that you may not be able to do yourself. Gather the information is useful. Is used a template as a basis for recording the information. And there were ready-made templates to collect information. Collecting the information and putting it in the right template is important. You would need to analyze the findings, identify which of these factors listed above are the most important or could cause issues, and you need to identify the business specific options to address the issues. You would need to write a discussion document to all stakeholders, disseminate and discuss the findings with stakeholders and decision makers, and also decide what actions need to be taken and which trends to monitor on an ongoing basis. Pestle shouldn't just be a one-off, but it should be done on an ongoing basis. Tips when thinking about using Pestle. Well, Pestle forms or sits within the situation analysis, but there are other models as well that sit within the situation analysis, including SWOT and Porter's 5 Force model, and also Porter's Nation of Competitive Advantage, and other models that you could use as well to determine the competitiveness of that country or competitors. So, when you are looking at Pestle, you shouldn't really just be looking at Pestle in isolation. In other words, you should be looking at it in relation to an alliance with other models. in order for it to be successful. So then you can determine what the current situation is, taking a whole range of factors, and then planning your marketing strategy accordingly. So, who is going to use this information? Well, in workforce planning, HR within your organization and company, a Pestle analysis can help to identify disruptive changes to business models that may have a profound impact on the future employment landscape. Organizations are facing huge changes in their workforce and increased, skills gaps, the creation of job roles that did not exist 10 years ago, and job reductions or displacement. This pace of change, will only increase. So this will help you look at what is actually happening. Marketing planning. If you think about marketing planning process, normally you have the vision, mission, aims and objectives, and then you have the situational analysis using Pestle, SWOT, Porter's Five Force model at a minimum, and then that leads you into your marketing strategy, and then your marketing strategy leads you into the implementation of your marketing mix, your standard marketing mix and your extended marketing mix, including the product, price, place, promotion, people, process, and physical evidence. So this, in terms of the marketing planning process, will help you use all of that in terms of devising your strategy, which, as you know, would include three sections, which was your segmentation, your targeting, and then your positioning strategy in relation to your competitors, and then leading on to the implementation of the extended marketing mix. In terms of product development, Pestle will help you guide to what new things that you need to develop. If you think about so many other companies, if you think about Kodak, had been in the business, turning over billions, had 2,000 employees worldwide, and yet they had the first digital camera, but they always felt that people were going to develop films, and yet they had this technology well before everyone else, and they didn't capitalize on it. So product development, this can help you see, in terms of the social side, what people are doing and what people are using, what people expect, and therefore trying to meet the needs of your end consumer. A mutually satisfying exchange at a profit in the long term. The definition of marketing by Kotler and Porter. And even if you think, it also affects organizational change. Pestle will affect, what you do. If we think about Tesco's, if you think about Thomas Cook, trying to compete against the online marketplace, which they didn't succeed in doing. They didn't succeed, and the online marketplace took a lot of their business away, and we all saw what happened to Thomas Cook. If we think about Tesco's, you've got practices of continuous improvement, lean, total quality management. You've got Tesco's online. You've got the different Tesco's stores. You have the Tesco's scanning machines, and so you have a lot of technology being used inside now, and as well as that, consumers buying online and linking up to all these different companies. So again, organizational change in terms of how they structure their distribution centers in the UK for Tesco's, and then their warehousing, and how they organize all the deliveries. So this new technology and changing customers' needs means that there will be organizational changes. We've even seen increased competition from Tesco's in terms of Aldi and Lidl. So over the last 10 years, they've lost 10% of their market share. Losing 10% of their market share, resulted in them the first time, having a pre-tax loss of 5 billion. And subsequent to that, they bought Booker's, targeting the wholesalers and targeting a different marketplace to recuperate some of the profits being lost and market share being lost. So again, organizational change will occur from information from the situational analysis, also taken from Pestle. What are some of the advantages of Pestle? Well, it's a simple framework. Political, economic, social, legal, technological, and environmental factors. It facilitates an understanding of the wider business environment. From an external perspective, it encourages the development of external strategic thinking. So you're saying to yourself, what's happening in the external environment, and let's plan and position ourselves accordingly. It can, enable an organization to anticipate future business threats and take action to avoid or minimize their impact. But it should do. I mean, we've had Brexit for so long, and you ask yourself the question is that in terms of education, did colleges really, take into consideration, anticipate, and then have a good, clear plan in terms of knowing, for instance, what was going to happen with the decrease of students in the UK? And did and we've had this technology before. We've had blended learning over 5 years ago, but why didn't we use it then? Why wasn't this technology being used? So who is leading all this forward? It's all good and well having this and to see where the opportunities are, but from a strategic management perspective, are they actually being capitalized? Are they actually being used? It can also enable an organization to spot business opportunities, and we said, and exploit them fully, but only if you have the right management in place to capitalize on that. The disadvantages, sometimes you oversimplify the amount of data used for decisions. Sometimes you have insufficient data, and you may be making and basing strategic choices on that, and plowing resources in terms of people and money in terms of the marketing strategy, and it may not be correct. The risk of capturing too much data may lead to a paralysis of by analysis. The data used may be based on assumptions that later prove to be unfounded. And the pace of change makes it increasingly difficult to anticipate developments that may affect an organization in the future. So in order to be effective, the process needs to be repeated on a regular basis, and resources needs to be allocated to this in terms of analyzing the information and clearly defining the scope first in terms of what you're trying to determine. So that, in a nutshell, is Pestle. I hope this has helped. So thank you very much from Mr. Tan. I'd like you to do a little bit more homework. So if you haven't already, we would like you to download the ZapWorks Zapper app, either for your mobile or your laptop, for Google Play or Apple Store. And once you've downloaded it and you've got the Zapper scanner on your mobile, you just need to open it up and then put your phone in front of this barcode, and then this will lead you to another page which will tell you to go to other videos to watch as regards to this topic area. What have we covered so far? Well, we have covered, what is Pestle and the different elements of Pestle, being the political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental factors from an external perspective, from the country that you're looking at or the area that you're looking at, and how it can affect your business or service. We've looked at tips in terms of how you can use this, and reviewing kind of like the scope of the research and even the source of information that is required and needed. We've looked at what these can be used for, examples like workforce planning, for marketing perspectives, if the social society is changing and the demographic criteria or the psychographic or the behavioralistic criteria is changing of your target market. So this could actually affect your marketing of who you're targeting and your marketing strategy. We've looked at the benefits of the model. It's a simplistic model, and also it could allow you as a company to spot opportunities. And finally, we've looked at homework, again requiring you to look at additional videos that we would like you to see before you actually go ahead and undertake your own Pestle for your project. So thank you today from Mr. Tan.